Hi everyone, in today's video I want to share a very interesting gambit that you can play against the Scandinavian defense. The Scandinavian is a very tough nut to crack, so having an aggressive idea against it is nice to try. And if you play as black, at the end of the video I will show you the best way to play against it or how to avoid it. So after e4, d5, white takes on d5 and queen takes, we get the Scandinavian defense. Knight to c3 is the most common move in the position, just developing and attacking the queen. This is a minor drawback of the Scandinavian that black has to waste time with the queen. And queen to a5 is the most common reply against knight to c3. That's why this gambit you can play it against the main line. And here we get the gambit where white goes for b4. In a way, try to punish black for moving the queen too many times in the opening. And the idea is that after black takes the pawn on b4, we'll see the best way to avoid it for black later in the video. But after queen takes, rook to b1, attacking the queen. So this is a very forcing continuation that black has to be prepared against. The best way for black to go here is queen to d6. If the queen goes to any random square like h4, this will simply help white develop with a move like knight to f3. And if black goes to a5, the square where the queen was before taking the pawn, here white already has a very nice move, rook to b5, attacking the queen. The queen is pretty much run out of squares. Queen to a6 is the only move, and this queen feels very awkward there with the bishop on f1 ready to get a discover attack. For example, here white can continue knight to f3. There's no direct way to punish the queen there, but the queen is misplaced. And if the queen wants to get away from any potential attacks with a move like queen to e6, here we could even play the very pretty rook to e5. So we already get a very active rook in the opening. Or knight to e5 is a very nice try to punish black with the idea to go bishop to c4. Also, bishop to e2 is quite good here because white gets a lot of development for just one pawn. So after rook to b1, queen to d6 is the best way for black to go. And here we can continue with the move d4. And here black very often plays the move c6, which is a very common move that black plays in the main lines in the Scandinavian, because white might be ready to go knight to b5 and bishop to f4, putting pressure on c7. So after c6, white's main idea is to go knight to f3 and then develop the bishop to c4 or to d3 in some lines, as we'll see. And the main drawback that black has in this line is that black cannot easily develop the bishop on c8. So in the Scandinavian, black very often develops the bishop to f5 or g4, but this would run into rook takes b7. So we see that the rook on b1 is actually very nicely placed there. That's why black very often goes for the move g6 in order to fianchetto the bishop. Black could play the move e6 and play with the bishop on c8, but this is quite passive. So here white could continue with bishop to d3, and if black decides to go for knight to f6 and then bishop to e7 to develop, after white castles and bishop to e7, rook to e1, and black castles, white has a lot of compensation for the pawn, even a better position. White has a few options here. One idea that is really nice is to go rook to b3 with the idea to go knight to e4 and then try to swing the rook over to the king side. Or even go knight to e4 straight away, and after knight takes and rook takes, this rook is also ready to attack, so white has a great position. So with that in mind, g6 has been tried in this position without locking the bishop on c8 and ready to fianchetto the bishop. Even here, black has to be very careful, as we see. Here after the move bishop to c4, a natural move like knight to f6 would run into knight to g5, putting pressure on f7. So here in the model game that I have, where both players are very strong players, black went bishop to g7 with the idea to go knight to h6 against knight to g5, putting pressure on f7. Black is ready to go knight to h6. And the other idea is that knight to e5 is controlled by the bishop. If white wants to go knight to e5, putting pressure on f7, the e5 square is controlled. But even here, white first went knight to e4, attacking the queen on d6, and after queen to c7, white still played the move knight to e5. So white gave another pawn, but in this case, for this very strong bishop on g7 that was supposed to protect the king, here black took on e5, there was pressure on f7, and after d takes and queen takes, f3, now white's idea is to go bishop to b2, attacking the queen and the rook. So black went f6, which I was quite surprised to see. In any case, black's position is quite hard to play, but probably black was afraid of bishop to b2 after knight to f6, bishop to b2, and after the queen moves, here white can take on f6 and give a check. Although the king can try to hide on g7, this was black's best try. Because after f6, white castled look at black pieces on the 8th rank, and white pieces are ready to get active very quickly, like when knight to d7, rook to e1, and after king to f8, here white played king to h1. This is a common prophylactic idea to prevent any checks on this diagonal. And after queen to c7, here white went queen to e2, bishop to a3 was also possible, and black's position is really bad. After king to g7, bishop to e3, knight to f8, and bishop to a3. Black tried a nice defensive idea by going bishop to e6, trying to neutralize those bishops, and after bishop takes and knight takes, here white went knight to f2, allowing black back in the game. Instead, here white had a very nice way to finish the game after queen to c4, and after the knight moves, go knight to g5, planning to go queen to f7, and after black takes the knight, queen to d4 will give a check and collect the rook, because knight to f6 is not possible on account of rook takes e7. And now, before I show you how to play this as black, if you want to seriously improve at chess, feel free to check out my course that will provide you with a training plan for that in the description. So here the move c6 is quite okay for black, and after knight to f3, g6, as we saw in the game, was quite risky. So the move knight to f6 is a bit more flexible. This is something that black didn't manage to do in the game, to develop the knight to f6. And the idea is that if white goes bishop to d3, then g6 is possible. There's not going to be direct pressure on f7, and after bishop to c4, one idea is to reply with the move bishop to e6. So trying to neutralize this very strong bishop on c4. Here white has a few options. White could go bishop to d3, and then black will have to do something about this pawn on b7. For example, after a move like b5, white can castle, then go knight to g5, attacking the bishop. This is still a very complicated position and quite playable for white. Or white can also simply trade on e6, and after queen takes, go knight to e5. Now there's pressure on b7. Here black could go knight b to d7, counter-attacking, which is very often the best way to go. Here white can protect the knight, and sooner or later black will have to do something about the pawn on b7. For example, black could go b5 now, and white still gets very good compensation for the pawn with this very strong knight on e5. Now there's another idea after b4, which is to avoid the gambit, because white's position is a lot easier to play, and white also gets very good compensation for the pawn, and this is the move queen to b6. So instead of taking the pawn, black can go queen to b6, with the idea to continue playing standard moves in the Scandinavian like knight to f6, develop the bishop either to f5 or g4, and then go e6. And even here, white should normally continue with the move knight to f3, because after d4, here we could even consider taking the pawn, because this is an improved version of the gambit for black. Now the knight on c3 is pinned, so white cannot go rook to b1 straight away. So here after knight to f3, knight to f6, now we're ready to develop the bishop on c8. Bishop to c4 is the best try, if white wants to continue playing in the spirit of the gambit. And now we can finally develop the bishop to f5, and then we're ready to continue with e6 in order to develop the bishop on f8 and castle, which is something very standard in the Scandinavian defense. So here the bishop cannot develop to g4 because there's a very common tactical idea. White can take on f7 and then go knight to e5 and get the piece back. So hope that you enjoyed this very interesting gambit that you can definitely try as white, and you know how to play against it as black if you want to face it, or how you can avoid it if you want to avoid these complications. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.